Well, good morning. It's a pleasure to be a part of the Stories of Storyline. Let's try this. Stories of Storyline sermon series, which has been concocted really primarily under the idea that James Ramirez brought to us initially, and that was that we all have our stories of our lives, and we all hope to see in this church more and more how our stories are how they map out onto the large grand story that is told to us in Scripture about God's story. And so anyway, today is my opportunity to share some of my life with you. I come to speak to you not with some idea that I have a real firm, objective sense of my own life. I guess I'm probably the one most easily fooled about my own life. However, there are some things I'm very sure about in regards to my life up to this point, and it is really a pleasure to share them with you. So, stories of storyline. I was born in a town called Niles, Michigan, which is right down there in the southwest corner of Michigan. I was born on January 16, 1969, so I'll be 55 this coming January. My parents lived in Berrien Springs, which is right next to Niles, just a few miles away, but because Niles was the closest place with a hospital, that's where I emerged into the world in 1969. That's me, and I'm pictured here not quite before the invention of color film, but evidently before it was generally thought that it might be something you might want to use when photographing a guy for the very first time in his life. And I'm just a few hours old here, but looking still probably a little tired from the move. I was the second of two children born to my parents. My sister Maria was not quite 2 years old when I showed up on her doorstep. And Maria was my very first friend, and she remains today someone that we together share a special bond. Among my earliest memories are those of sitting with Maria on a blue couch that we owned, entertaining our minds with things like Gilligan's Island, looking at the television, Gilligan's Island and Warner Brothers cartoons. I think much of what I learned about civics and world history, I probably initially learned from Bugs Bunny. And so that's held me in good stead. When I was born, my dad was the assistant dean of men at Andrews University, which is a Seventh-day Adventist institution there in Michigan, and my mother was an elementary school teacher in the public school system. Both of my parents were from Pontiac, Michigan, and my parents had known each other since before they could remember, really. They met when they were very, very young. My mother was I'm losing my gadget here. My mother was the fourth of 9 children born to Paul and Velma Wilson of Pontiac, Michigan. And why don't we just shove it in a pocket? Sorry, here, fixing my girdle. So this is Paul and Velma Wilson, my mother's parents, good-looking young couple. They were married in, I think, 1912 or something, probably not that early. And but there were 9 kids in the family, and so it was a home full of children and probably a few cats, and it was quite a musical family, actually. My Uncle Danny, who's the oldest there, playing the violin, and most everyone in the family loved singing. In fact, they would put on little programs in the churches in their area growing up. And neighbors and friends would tell you that the Wilson home was a welcoming place. Velma, my mother's mother, taught piano lessons and played the organ at church, and Paul, my grandfather, earned a living in carpet cleaning around the Pontiac, Michigan area. My dad, was the youngest of 5 children born to William and Marguerite Racine. William, or Bill Racine as he was known, drove a truck around the Pontiac, Michigan area delivering milk when that was a thing. And Margie was a school teacher, and evidently also she was sort of the neighborhood nurse. What I have heard was that when a kid needed an enema, they would call my grandmother Margie to come and give an enema. So evidently that was a thing too. My grandfather, my grandpa Racine, had come from a long line of Catholic French Canadians who had settled in Quebec in the 1600s and then eventually migrated further west into Michigan. It's probably correct to say that he was a nominal Catholic. As a boy, he could recite the rosary in French, but the family lore is that he was kind of more inclined to reciting dirty French songs, which also was a thing. My grandmother, I should say, they did have 5 kids. There were 2 and then a space of a few years and then 3 more, and I think my father is the baby there. He must be. My grandmother had been raised in a Protestant home, and at some point after they were married and had begun to make a family, she and a friend began attending some meetings in the Pontiac area which were being given by 2 Seventh-day Adventist evangelists, the Venden brothers. And as a result, before long, she began to observe the Seventh-day Sabbath. My grandpa, eyeing this turn of events with growing concern and being quite certain that she must be making a mistake, picked up his Bible and began to read carefully with the idea that he would show her where she had been deceived. And, well, he fell in love with Jesus and along the way discovered the gift of the Seventh-day Sabbath and wound up joining my grandmother in her membership at the Adventist Church in Pontiac. Now, you need to know a little bit more about my grandpa Racine's growing up years. While he was still very young, his father, which would be my paternal great-grandfather, died. I think he was 3 years old when his father died. And so as things developed, his mother was unable to support her children. And so to my understanding, while he was still a boy, he was raised by 1 or more different families in the Bay City, Michigan area, and eventually earned his room and board in farm work. To my knowledge then, my grandfather grew up without a father, a simple fact, the repercussions of which I think have had an effect on my life, and which we'll say more about shortly. I mentioned my grandfather's roots in French Canada, and before that in Normandy, France, for the purpose of telling you a little bit about this man. This man, if France had an answer to England's William Shakespeare, and I'm not saying France had an answer to William Shakespeare, but if it did, it must have been Jean-Baptiste Racine, I think is how they pronounce the name, Jean-Baptiste Racine. Jean Racine was a 17th century dramatist, a writer of plays for production on Paris stages in the genre of neoclassical tragedy, which simply means stories about people whose lives, after reaching a certain level of station in life, either through wealth or nobility or royalty or usually all 3, whose lives came completely unglued due to their own unwitting self-destructive actions and choices. These were plays crafted after the style of classical Greek dramatists such as Euripides, Sophocles, etc. Jean Racine believed that human beings live ultimately uncontrollable and unavoidably tragic lives because they are at the mercy of emotions and desires that they cannot control. His worldview contained an enigma of divine contradiction in which God, or the God he believed in, had created human beings with uncontrollable passions and then warned them that they would be destroyed if they did not control them. The main characters of his plays, works like Britannicus and Phaedra, were people ruled by their own romantic or sexual desire, whose passions would blossom into total destruction of their dignity as human beings, depriving them of their reason or leading them to their deaths. My family's French ancestor, Etienne Racine, left Normandy for the New World in 1634, a few years before Jean Racine was born. And so I can't be descended from Jean Racine, but we like to speculate that maybe he's a cousin of some remove. I find it interesting now how his view of human nature would describe aspects of my life my life story, at least up to a certain point. Well, so my parents met each other, as I said, when they were just kids. Their families lived across town from each other, but were acquainted through attending the same church. In early elementary school, the first time he laid eyes on her, my dad noticed my mother's dark curls and blue eyes, and before long had set himself to the task of winning her heart by buying her chocolate-covered cherries. Meanwhile, my mother remained blissfully unaware of his romantic interest, as she was quite driven and was more concerned with earning good marks in first grade than in being romanced by a second grade boy. However, at the ages of 8 and 9, or 9 and 8, they married. No, they didn't marry. That they were miniature bride and groom in my dad's oldest sister's wedding, and 15 years later, in July 1964, they would be married in that same church, which is cool. So my family lived in Berrien Springs, Michigan until I was 8, and in 1977 we moved from Michigan to Loma Linda, California, where my dad was an administrator at the University Medical Center there, and my mother taught school. My sister and I began school in the 4th and the 3rd grade at Redlands Junior Academy. Among my most enjoyable memories from school days, especially in Redlands, along with my sister Maria, was singing together in the Redland Airs, the school choir that you needed to audition for. And there is a local personality on the up on the screen. Actually, I'll point out myself in the front row with the messed up tie, and my sister's showing some leg next to me. And then up at the top right, the girl at the topmost right is Dr. Rolanda Everett, a pediatrician in Springfield. So famous people. And so that was fun. Several months ago at Storyline, under the title Made in the Image, I spoke about how idolatry changes the idolater according to the natural principle that we become what we worship. We gradually become like whatever it is that we worship and admire. And I mentioned that in the early 1980s, I began to devote some of my energy to the music of the pop group Duran Duran. By the 1980s, popular music was already soaked in the logical outworkings of postmodernity, which is a worldview that says that there is no inherent purpose or meaning in life, and that to infuse some kind of self-determined meaning into your life, all you have to do is to act out the dictates of your own will. Pursue what feels good. Do what you want. Because meaninglessness is at its core, this is a philosophy of futility, and it was articulated beginning in the late 1960s and then on through the 1970s by, wouldn't you know it, 3 French existentialist philosophers from left to right, Michel Foucault, Jacques Derrida, and Jean-François Lyotard. Postmodernity was and is unique in that, despite it having its beginnings as an academic and theoretical philosophical project, it has broken out well beyond the boundaries of academia and has soaked the society of the Western world. And there are many strands of postmodernity which are destructive to society, not least of which is this ethos of do what feels good, which impacted the attitudes toward sexuality in the Western world. One of the ways in which this played out was through the popular music industry, increasing use of sexually suggestive lyrics and imagery. As I alluded to in Made in the Image, due to having set my ears and eyes and mind on what Duran Duran and other groups were producing, including their music videos, my view of women as an adolescent boy, in a subtle way, developed into a subconscious or perhaps conscious objectification of women. I look at it now in terms like this, that in some corner of my mind, like a secret little room in a large house with many rooms, in some corner of my mind, I was okay with looking at women primarily as objects of sexual interest or gratification. At around that same time, in the early 1980s, I had obtained one of the very first personal computers to hit the market, a Commodore VIC-20. Does anyone remember the Commodore VIC-20? I see a few faces smiling. So the rest of you will enjoy this bit of technological marvel. The VIC-20 was equipped with a dazzling 3.5 kilobytes of RAM memory. That is 0.0035 megabytes of RAM. And because dedicated computer monitors were not really quite a thing yet, the video output of the VIC-20 was meant to run through a television screen. So with my VIC-20, I had a 13-inch Toshiba television in my bedroom serving as a monitor. I didn't spend a lot of time watching TV. However, I discovered in flipping through the UHF channels with this dial that you would click through, that way out, what seemed way out on channel 52, was an early version in the Los Angeles area of pay-per-view TV called On TV. Now, the image of On TV was broadcast scrambled, and a subscriber would lease a decoder box that would unscramble the image. But it was broadcast scrambled, and you could pretty well figure out what was happening on the screen. And late at night, were broadcast what were called adult movies. And so, at 14 years of age, late one evening in my own bedroom, I stumbled across pornography and simultaneously discovered that I was farther along into puberty than I had realized. And that began a periodic, recurring habit of the consumption of such images and of self-medicating with dopamine. I believe it was shortly after this had started to be a secret habit. My dad and I were going somewhere in the car together, and he raised the topic of puberty, sort of. For reasons that I'll mention later, I believe puberty and sexuality were a challenging topic for my dad, as I think they are for many parents. But as I recall, he had said something about the fact that I was reaching an age in which my body would start changing and I would begin to have greater and greater interest in girls or something along those lines. And while he was speaking, my internal monologue was approximately, newsflash, the body changes are already well underway, and this is not something I really want to talk about. I already had a sense of shame surrounding sexuality. And so without much effort, I was able to diffuse the situation with some kind of subject change, probably to baseball. And that was the discussion. It took a shorter time than it took me to explain it. Well, so I finished high school in 1987 at Monterey Bay Academy, a boarding school on the Central California coast, and I finished my BS degree in college in 1991 and finally medical school at Loma Linda in 1995. While these years passed, I think I was pretty much lost as far as relationships are concerned. I was very interested in girls, but was almost always single. I usually didn't have a girlfriend per se. And I think I had a real lack of confidence in myself, which I was able to cover up to some degree with an artificial extroversion and with humor. I wasn't necessarily without female companionship, I just didn't understand how to settle down. I had a poor understanding of how a relationship should work, and I'm afraid that I often self-servingly engaged in physical relationships while avoiding true relationship and vulnerability. Whether or not I was fully aware of it at the time, true to form for a tragic Racine character, I was driven largely by emotion and by a self-referent sexuality, which was harmful both to my personal maturity and to others. This church is called Storyline for a specific reason, and that was to highlight a closely related set of inescapable realities. Human beings created in the image of God live in narrative, by which we mean that we respond to story. We receive, understand, and convey meaning through story. Our individual lives are our stories, and our stories interrelate on a horizontal plane and are inextricably a part of a grand overarching story, a meta-narrative, if you like, which is God's story. through which he invites every person to come to know him and his character of steadfast, unwavering love. I want to try to illustrate the reality of God's grand narrative versus the alternate story, which, as was told by the French postmodern philosophers. Imagine living in a time and a place in which the sky above your head was always overcast with a thick cloud cover, such that during the daytime you could see neither blue sky nor the sun in its course, and at night neither stars nor moon were visible. Through your own experience, you knew nothing of the phases of the moon, and no one around you had any experience of these realities, and no one had for centuries, just overcast. That might be our situation were it not for what Christians sometimes refer to as special revelation, by which they mean the Bible and God's discrete actions in history, and also general revelation, by which they mean the design, the rational intelligibility, and beauty and order which is evident in the natural world. The French existentialists would have you believe that there is nothing up beyond that overcast, and that all these silly ancient myths of a sky above, of sun, moon, and stars above those clouds are merely fictitious, well past their expiration date. But God hasn't left us in such a situation. Rather, he is continually breaking through the cloud cover of our own finiteness to reveal himself in his story to us. And one way in which God broke through to me occurred in the following way. In the late 90s, during my residency at Loma Linda, I was attending a weekly Sabbath school class, you could say a Sunday school class, but we met on Sabbath, Saturdays. It was held on the university campus, and it was taught by a professor of Bible studies named Graham Maxwell. And Graham Maxwell was teaching a picture of God that was, it took me about 3 years to recognize the fact, but he was teaching a picture of God that was fundamentally different from the picture I grew up with in an Adventist home, in a Christian home, going to church, going to Sabbath school. Graham was teaching a picture of God based on all 66 books of the Old and the New Testaments, which was something fundamentally different than I had grown up with. He was talking about a story. He was talking about a God with a story. A God who had suffered a character assassination, but who, despite all the other versions which had circulated about him, was represented perfectly by Jesus as a gentle, kind, healing God. He was not the arbitrary, vindictive, judgmental God that I had sometimes pictured prior to that. Graham Maxwell taught me to understand the wrath of God in a new and highly sympathetic light, and that sin is not a legal problem merely needing forgiveness, but that sin rather is a lethal problem needing healing that only God can provide. The theology I learned to love in Graham Maxwell's class prepared me to recognize it when in mostly parallel lines, I heard it again here at Storyline. This understanding of sin and its remedy helped me to see how my sexual immorality and addiction to pornography needed healing, at least as much as it needed forgiveness. In 2001, I was 32 years old, and I was living in Ann Arbor, Michigan, taking my training in endocrinology. My parents lived in California, but that year my dad came to visit me for a few days there in Michigan, and while we were sitting at a restaurant, we were talking about his childhood and his parents. My grandpa Racine had passed away in 1976, and I have pleasant memories of him. He was a gentle and kind man and a loving grandfather. My dad would often recall that his father, my grandpa, could never talk about what Jesus had done for him without tears in his eyes. But on this occasion, the conversation touched on the fact that my grandpa Racine had grown up without a father, and somewhat out of the blue, it seemed to me at the time it was out of the blue, my dad said, "He never told me about the birds and the bees." The birds and the bees. All at once, this phrase struck me as rather quaint. I hadn't heard it in a while. But something also clicked for me just then, that my dad probably had difficulty knowing what to say to help me to anticipate and prepare not only for puberty, but also for a healthy mindset surrounding sexuality, because his dad had had no model for such fathering. Through no one's fault, there was this lack of communication coming down through the generations of males in my father's family line. And here I was into my 30s playing a game at offering attention and love to a woman in order to get physical intimacy in return, all while intermittently consuming online pornography and experiencing in myself the natural consequences of an increasingly self-referent sexuality. I realized that what I was doing was not working for me, nor for anyone else who I may have been involved with. I could see that the man I wanted to be was further and further out of my grasp or ability to emulate or even to imagine, but I did understand in terms that I needed healing. And it turned out that Jesus had not given up on me. In about 2009, I found myself joining a Christian men's purity recovery group which met at a church in downtown Grand Rapids, where I lived, in Michigan. And something that I heard said there made an impression on me because I could glimpse the truth of it for myself, and it brings to mind Jean Racine and his characters. And that was this: if you continue upon this path of addiction, you will wind up in prison, insane, or dead. It was something that Jean Racine would have grasped. By the time I met Olya just before turning 43 in January 2012, I had taken the first steps in a process of recovery, yet was still a little bit skeptical that a truly loving and committed relationship would be possible for me. But as Olya and I began to become acquainted with one another, I found that because she also loved Jesus, she was understanding and patient with me, and I found that I could share with her about my struggle with pornography and my desire to be free of it. That was about our second date, and actually we're in the balcony of the Chicago Theater at a Peter Frampton concert, which was fun. He played the whole Frampton Comes Alive album and then some other stuff. So Olya lived in Maryland and I was in Michigan, but we were able to see each other at least once or twice per month during 2012. And in August that year, with her awareness, I spent a weekend in Colorado Springs at a place called Heart to Heart Counseling Center at what they called a weekend intensive. There I met with a man named Dr. Doug Weiss and his team, and received much helpful information and understanding, which I could go into perhaps another time. But the overarching important message was recovery is possible in Jesus. And Jesus has designed it such that you cannot do that without a fellowship of reliable, close friends who also love Jesus, who are familiar with your journey, and who can keep you accountable. With thanks to Jesus, my Messiah, I have experienced and am experiencing an increasing freedom from slavery, not simply to a set of behaviors surrounding the consumption of pornography, but also a larger freedom from a mindset of sexually immoral thought pattern. But as liberating as the experience has been and continues to be, I would not rest content with only a simple awareness of my own little privatized story. I think that's the day I proposed. It was the day before I proposed marriage to my wife and my now wife. And we were in London, England, actually, and she essentially said, I'll give you a definite maybe. And then it was about a month later when she said yes. And in any case, we were married in July of 2013. So my own little story is nice in its way, but as I mentioned, I would not be content with it were it not part of a much larger grand narrative, writ large, a much story. The grand narrative is actually about God. The grand narrative is about the goodness of a God which is so impossible to our accustomed earthly ways of thinking that we find ourselves tempted to disbelieve when it first comes to our ears. The Most High God is perfectly revealed, is fully manifest by the humility, the gentleness, the kindness, and the self-sacrificial commitment, the healing power and willingness which were demonstrated by the perfect life and the death of Jesus of Nazareth. Just a couple more photos for you. This is my sister's wedding in 2014. This was 3 years before my mother passed away from Alzheimer's disease, but that was a special and beautiful day. And just very briefly, I know you're mostly aware of our situation. We're hoping, praying, planning, intending to adopt these 3 kids. The 2 girls pictured on the left are Masha and Katya. They're in Poland currently. Their brother Kostya, pictured on the right, is in Romania. We trust that in the Lord's time they will be living with us. My story has taken a dramatic turn away from a path towards destruction that I have no doubt that I was on at one point in the past. And I came across a verse that, based upon its word usage and style, I had assumed must be from an old Christian hymn, a hymn that I evidently hadn't heard before. However, I was pleased to learn that it was written recently by a Matt Boswell, who is 10 years younger than I am. So he was born the year that Jean-Francois Lyotard published his book whose title escapes me on postmodernism. And so evidently Matt Boswell has also found that there is a grand narrative, despite what the French existentialists would have you say. They said, no, there are no grand narratives. And hymns like this remind us that even in the 21st century, there are grand narratives. And I will leave you with this. What love could remember no wrongs we have done? Omniscient, all-knowing, he counts not their sum. Thrown into a sea without bottom or shore, our sins, they are many. His mercy is more.